Story 1.
I remember that summer in Harlan, Kentucky, like it was etched into the ridges of these old hills themselves. It was 1978, and I'd just turned 22, fresh out of nursing school in Lexington, chasing what I thought was independence in a place where the world felt both too close and endlessly distant. Harlan sat nestled in a valley carved by ancient rivers, surrounded by mountains that loomed like silent guardians, their slopes thick with oak and hickory that turned the air heavy with the scent of green decay. Coal was king back then, but the mines were sputtering, leaving folks hollow-eyed and wary. I took a job at the county clinic, tending to black lung cases and the occasional knife fight aftermath, figuring it was a stepping stone to somewhere brighter. The boarding house I shared with 3 other girls was on the edge of town, a sagging 2-story affair with peeling white paint and a porch that creaked under the weight of evening rains. It had been a miner's home once, they said, built sturdy against the winters but worn thin by time. My roommates were like me, young women from scattered counties, all of us drawn here by slim prospects and the promise of steady pay. There was Sarah, a teacher with a laugh that could cut through fog. Ellie, quiet and bookish, studying to be a secretary. And June, the bold one, always talking about heading west to California. We weren't kin, but in that isolated spot, we became something close, huddling against the loneliness that seeped in from the woods. The days blurred into a routine that felt safe in its predictability. Mornings started with the clinic's fluorescent hum, the sharp tang of antiseptic mingling with the earthy sweat of patients who'd trudged miles from their hollows. Afternoons were for errands in town, where the general store's bell jangled like a warning and folks nodded without much talk. Evenings, though, those were ours. We'd gather in the living room after supper, the room lit by a single lamp with a yellowed shade that cast long shadows across the threadbare rug. The house backed right up to the forest, so close you could hear the branches scraping the eaves like fingers testing for weakness. On clear nights, we'd crack the windows to let in the breeze, carrying hints of pine and the distant rumble of coal trains snaking through the passes. But that July, the heat clung like a fever, the air so humid it felt like breathing underwater. Storms brewed most afternoons, thunder echoing off the ridges like muffled artillery, leaving the ground slick and the nights unnaturally still. That particular night started ordinary enough, the kind of evening that lulls you into forgetting how fragile things are. We'd finished a simple meal, cornbread and beans washed down with iced tea, and migrated to the living room, our sanctuary sorts. Sarah had brewed a pot of weak coffee, the aroma fighting against the musty smell of the old furniture. We sprawled on the mismatched chairs and sofa, feet propped up, swapping stories to pass the time. Ellie was recounting a tale from the clinic about an old miner who swore the hills whispered his name before cave-ins, her voice soft and measured, drawing us in. June laughed it off, calling it superstition born from too much moonshine. Well, I shared about a patient I'd seen that day, a young mother with bruises she wouldn't explain, her eyes darting like trapped animals. The conversation flowed easy, laced with the optimism of youth, even as the darkness pressed against the windows. Outside, the world had gone quiet, no crickets chirping, no owls calling, just the occasional drip from the gutters, remnants of an earlier rain. The door to the porch was locked, a simple bolt we'd all checked out of habit, though in these parts folks rarely bothered with intruders, who'd come all the way out here, we figured, when the roads twisted like veins and led nowhere fast. It was about 9 when the knock came, soft and deliberate, 3 gentle raps that could have been a branch tapping in the wind. We paused mid-laughter, heads tilting like deer sensing a shift in the air. "Probably nothing," June said, waving it off, but her voice held an edge I hadn't heard before. We waited, the silence stretching, and when no second knock followed, we shrugged and continued. Ellie picked up her story, but the words felt forced now, the room's warmth turning clammy. Then the knob rattled, subtle at first, like someone testing it casually. My heart skipped, a cold prickle running down my spine. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her tone more curious than afraid. No answer, just the slow turn of the handle.
Story 2.
I grew up in the mist-cloaked valleys of West Virginia, where the hills roll like the spine of some ancient beast, and the fog hangs low most mornings, turning the world into a place of half-seen shapes and muffled echoes. It was a hard-scrabble life in those parts, especially after the war ended in '45, when men coming home changed or not at all, and the coal seams running thinner by the year. My family had a small farmstead tucked in a misty hollow, a narrow cut between two ridges about 5 miles outside Elkins. The house was little more than weathered boards and a tin roof that sang in the rain, surrounded by fields that gave way to dense woods, oaks and maples tangled with underbrush so thick it could swallow a man whole if he wandered too far. My grandfather lived with us then, a stooped figure with lungs blackened from the mines, who spent his evenings by the fire spinning yarns about the old days. He'd talk of disappearances that plagued the region during the Depression, folks vanishing on routine walks to town or while checking trap lines in the forest. "The hills take what they want," he'd said, his voice gravelly from too many smokes, eyes staring into the flames as if seeing shadows there. "Ain't always bears or bootleggers. Sometimes it's something quieter, something that don't leave tracks." I listened as a boy, half scared, half skeptical, figuring it was just the ramblings of an old man chasing ghosts. But those stories planted seeds, the kind that sprout in the quiet moments, making you glance over your shoulder when the wind shifts. By 1947, I was 24, back from the Pacific with a limp from a shrapnel wound and a mind that wouldn't settle. The war had left me restless, dreams filled with jungle ambushes and faces I'd rather forget. Work was scarce. The sawmill in town hired me on part-time, cutting lumber from the very woods that bordered our land. Days were long, filled with the whine of blades and the sharp scent of fresh sawn pine, but it was the nights that wore on me, lying awake in the loft, listening to the house settle like it was breathing. My folks were getting on, Ma tending the garden with a weariness that tugged at me, Pa out mending fences or bartering for seed. Grandfather had passed the winter before, his tales lingering like smoke in the rafters. To clear my head, I'd taken to hiking the overgrown trails near the farmstead, paths my family had tried for generations, winding up the slopes where the air grew cooler and the world felt a touch removed. It was my way of chasing solitude, away from the clamor of town and the weight of expectations. The forest had a rhythm to it, birds calling in the canopy, leaves rustling underfoot, the occasional snap of a twig could be a deer or nothing at all. But there was always that undercurrent, a hush that made you feel watched, like the trees themselves held grudges against intruders. That autumn morning started like any other, the kind of day that fools you into thinking the world is gentle. October had turned the leaves to fire, reds and golds that lit the hollow despite the overcast sky. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy tang of decaying foliage, and a light mist clung to the branches, drifting like reluctant spirits unwilling to leave the earth. I'd woken early before the sun crested the ridge, the house still dark and quiet save for the tick of the kitchen clock. Ma was stirring oatmeal on the stove, the steam mixing with the smell of wood smoke from the fire. "Going out again?" she asked, not looking up, her voice laced with that quiet worry mothers carry. I nodded, grabbing my jacket, a worn wool thing from the army days, and a canteen of water. Pi was already in the barn, his cough echoing as he fed the mule. I didn't tell them much about my walks. They figured it was just a young man burning off steam, and I let him believe it. The truth was, the trails offered a kind of peace, a place to sort through the fragments the war had left in my head. I set out just as dawn broke, the light filtering through the fog in pale shafts, turning the path into a tunnel of gray. The ground was soft under my boots, muddied from recent rains, and the underbrush whispered as I brushed past, thorns snagging at my pants like fingers grasping. The trail I chose that day was an old one, seldom used since the logging roads had bypassed it years back. It snaked up the hillside, past the remnants of a stone fence from some long-gone settler, then dipped into a denser thicket where the trees crowded close, the trunks moss-covered and twisted. I'd hiked it before, drawn to the solitude, the way the sounds of the world faded until all you heard was your own breath and the drip of condensation from leaves. About a mile in, the mist thickened, swirling around my legs like river water, and the air grew cooler, carrying a faint metallic hint that I chalked up to the damp earth. Birds flitted in the branches overhead, their calls sharp but sparse, as if they too sensed the hush settling over the woods. I paused at a fallen log, sitting to drink from my canteen, the water cold against my throat. That's when I noticed it, the absence, like the forest was holding its breath. No squirrels chattering, no wind rustling the canopy, just stillness, broken only by the distant call of the crow, sounding mournful and far off. I shook it off, blaming my imagination, those old stories bubbling up unbidden. Grandfather's voice echoed in my mind. When the birds go silent, best turn back. But I pressed on, the path narrowing, forcing me to push through brambles that clawed at my sleeves. It was maybe another half hour before I stumbled upon her, though stumbled ain't quite right. It was more like the woods led me there, the trail curving just so, the mist parting like a curtain. I was navigating a small clearing, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches, when my boot caught on something soft, yielding. I looked down, expecting a rotten log or a pile of leaves, but instead there she was, a young woman, or what was left of her, ranged in the underbrush as if posed for some god-forsaken photograph. She lay on her back, arms folded neatly across a chest, legs straight, but the two halves severed clean at the waist, the two halves placed with deliberate care, like a doll broken and reassembled wrong. Her skin was pale, drained of color, almost waxen in the diffused light, and her lips were painted an unnatural red, stark against the pallor, as if applied after whatever had happened. There was no blood, not a drop staining the leaves or soaking the earth, just that eerie cleanliness that made my stomach turn. Her eyes were open, staring skyward, but in that moment they seemed to shift, locking on the mind, pleading for answers that hung unspoken in the air. I froze, heart pounded in the quiet, the world narrowing to that spot, the mist curling around her form, the faint scent of decay mixing with the forest's rot. Who was she? A local girl, maybe? Or a traveler passing through? Her dress was simple, homespun cotton, torn at the edges but otherwise tidy, no signs of struggle, no footprints marring the ground around her, just her, displayed like a trophy in the heart of the woods. Panic hit slow at first, a cold wave rising from my gut, making my hands tremble as I backed away. My mind raced. Drifter? Some madman hiding in the hills? Or something darker, like the legends grandfather whispered about? Feral folk living wild in the deep woods, shunning society and taking what they needed without remorse. I'd heard tales of them, descendants of deserters or outcasts, surviving on the fringes, their humanity worn thin by isolation. But this was precise, almost artistic in its horror, not the work of a beast, but a mind twisted, quiet, and deliberate. I turned and ran then, or tried to, my limp slowing me, branches whipping my face as I crashed back down the trail. The forest felt alive now, every rustle of pursuit, every shadow a figure lurking just out of sight. I burst from the woods onto the farmstead's edge, gasping, Ma rushing out at the sound. "What in God's name?" she cried, but I could barely speak, words tumbling out about the body, the severance, the silence. Pa fetched the sheriff from town, a burly man named Harlan, with a mustache like broom bristles and eyes that had seen too much. They followed me back, a small posse of deputies and neighbors, their lanterns cutting through the gathering dusk, for by then hours had slipped away in the haze of shock. The police combed the area, but the mist had thickened, swallowing details, and they found nothing beyond what I'd described. No tracks, no weapon, no clues to her identity. Whispers spread quick in Elkins, folks bolting doors earlier, children kept from playing in the woods. Some said it was a killer toying with victims, draining them elsewhere before posing them in hidden spots, a signature that matched a couple of unsolved cases from up north. Others muttered about forest legends, old spirits or feral clans that emerged when the fog rolled in. The investigation dragged, questions leading to dead ends, the sheriff's frustration mounting as leads evaporated like morning dew. I gave my statement a dozen times, each retelling chipping away at me, the image of her eyes replaying in my mind. Nights grew worse after that. I'd lie awake, hearing footsteps on the gravel path outside, soft and measured, like someone circling the house. Was it imagination or something real? The wind through the trees sounded like whispers now, calling names I couldn't quite make out, and shadows in the corners of the room stretched longer, more insistent. Months passed, the town settling into a watchful hush, but the dread never left me. I quit the sawmill, took to staying close to the farm, fixing what didn't need fixing, my limp a constant reminder of vulnerabilities. Dreams came vivid, her face in the mist, lips moving silently, eyes following me through endless woods. I'd wake sweating, the house creaking as if echoing my unrest. Folks avoided Misty Hollow more than before, the trails overgrown further, claimed by vines and forgetfulness. No more bodies turned up, at least none we heard of, but that didn't ease the weight. Appalachia has a way of amplifying isolation, turning every rustle into a threat, every fog-shrouded dawn into a question. I still hike those paths sometimes, drawn back against better sense, listening for eerie sounds that might explain it all. But the hills keep their secrets, deep and unyielding, leaving me with a quiet fear that whatever did that to her is still out there, waiting in the mist for the next solitary soul to wander too far. And on still mornings, when the birds fall silent, I wonder if it's watching me even now, patient as the roots burrowing into the earth. Story 3. The police combed the area, but the mist had thickened, swallowing details, and they found nothing beyond what I'd described. No tracks, no weapon, no clues to her identity. Whispers spread quick in Elkins, folks bolting doors earlier, children kept from playing in the woods. Some said it was a killer toying with victims, draining them elsewhere before posing them in hidden spots, a signature that matched a couple of unsolved cases from up north. Others muttered about forest legends, old spirits, or feral clans that emerged when the fog rolled in. The investigation dragged, questions leading to dead ends, the sheriff's frustration mounting as leads evaporated like morning dew. I gave my statement a dozen times, each retelling chipping away at me, the image of her eyes replaying in my mind. Nights grew worse after that. I'd lie awake, hearing footsteps on the gravel path outside, soft and measured, like someone circling the house. Was it imagination or something real? The wind through the trees sounded like whispers now, calling names I couldn't quite make out, and shadows in the corners of the room stretched longer, more insistent. Months passed, the town settling into a watchful hush, but the dread never left me. I quit the sawmill, took to staying close to the farm, fixing what didn't need fixing, my limp, constant reminder of vulnerabilities. Dreams came vivid, her face in the mist, lips moving silently, eyes following me through endless woods. I'd wake sweating, the house creaking as if echoing my unrest. Folks avoided Misty Hollow more than before, the trails overgrown further, claimed by vines and forgetfulness. No more bodies turned up, at least none we heard of, but that didn't ease the weight. Appalachia has a way of amplifying isolation, turning every rustle into a threat, every fog-shrouded dawn into a question. I still hike those paths sometimes, drawn back against better sense, listening for eerie sounds that might explain it all. But the hills keep their secrets, deep and unyielding, leaving me with a quiet fear that whatever did that to her is still out there, waiting in the mist for the next solitary soul to wander too far. And on still mornings, when the birds fall silent, I wonder if it's watching me even now, patient as the roots burrowing into the earth. By evening, the little things started adding up. Back in my room, a faint metallic scent hung in the air, like rusts mixed with something sharper, almost like old pennies. I opened the window, but it only let in the chill and the whisper of wind through the pines. Dinner was solitary. The other guests had vanished to their rooms, and the clerk locked up early, leaving me with a key to the side door. I tried reading a paperback I'd brought, but the dripping faucet returned, insistent, syncing with my pulse. Around 2 a.m., insomnia gripped me hard, the kind where your mind races through regrets, replaying conversations that ended badly. I slipped on my shoes and wandered the halls, the carpet muffling my steps, the walls lined with faded photos of the lodge in its heyday, smiling families on the porch, fishermen with stringers of trout. But the smiles looked forced now, eyes hollow in the dim light from the emergency fixtures. As I passed closed doors, I heard whispers, muffled arguments that faded when I paused to listen, like radio static tuning out. Room 208, a woman's voice, soft and pleading, cut off mid-sentence. Room 210, a man's low murmur, angry but indistinct. I told myself it was guests talking in their sleep, or thin walls carrying sounds from downstairs, but the hairs on my arm stood up. The elevator groaned again, doors opening on an empty car, the interior lit by a flickering bulb that buzzed like trapped insects. I headed downstairs, drawn by a curiosity I couldn't shake, the lodge feeling larger in the dark, corridors stretching longer than they should. The basement access was through a door marked staff only, but it swung open easy, hinges silent as if oiled recently. Steps led down to a laundry room, concrete floors cold underfoot, the air thicker with that metallic tang, now mixed with the bleach sharpness of detergents. Washers and dryers lined one wall, silent sentinels, and in the corner sat a large water tank, the kind for the building supply, its lid slightly ajar. A hum came from it, faint, like a pump cycling but irregular. I approached slow, flashlight from my phone cutting through the gloom, heart thudding in my ears. Peering in, the beam caught something pale, floating just below the surface, like discarded laundry bunched up. But then it resolved, a shape, human, contorted in ways that defied the tank's confines, limbs twisted at odd angles, face turned upward with eyes wide and unseeing. It was a woman, her skin bloated and pale, hair fanning out like weeds in a stream. No blood, no obvious wounds, just that unnatural pose, as if she'd been folded in there deliberate, alive or not when it happened. I recoiled, phone clattering to the floor, the light spinning wild shadows across the walls. Bile rose in my throat, the scent overwhelming now. Rust and regret, yes, but undercut by the sweet rot of decay. I scrambled back up the stairs, banging on the clerk's door until he answered, bleary-eyed in his undershirt. "Call the police," I gasped, words tumbling out about the tank, the body. The sheriff's deputies arrived within the hour, lights flashing silent in the night, no sirens to disturb the hills. They cordoned off the basement, radios crackling with static as they hauled her out. She was identified later as a hiker who'd vanished weeks before, checked in alone like me, seeking solitude. No family to claim her, just a missing persons report from Knoxville. The coroner said drowning, but the contortions suggested struggle, maybe panic in the confined space. How she'd gotten in there, lid replaced, that remained a mystery. The clerk shook his head during questioning, claiming he'd checked the tank days ago, found nothing amiss. Rumors swirled among the locals who gathered at the edges, suicides and accidents plaguing the lodge for years. A jumper from the roof in '72, a carbon monoxide leak in '85 that took a family of 4, a maid who slipped in the bath and never surfaced. Folks whispered the building lured the desperate, its isolation amplifying despair until folks sought ends in hidden places. "The hills soak it up," one deputy muttered to me off record, "turn sorrow into something that sticks." I gave my statement in the lobby, hands shaking around a styrofoam cup of coffee, the elderly couple peeking from their door before retreating. The trucker had checked out early, engine rumbling away into the dark. Dawn broke, gray and reluctant, mist rolling down from the ridges like breath from the mountains. I packed hastily, duffel thrown in the trunk, the lodge's shadow long across the lot. Driving out, the forest closed in, branches arching overhead like a tunnel, and I caught glimpses in the rear view, flickering lights in upper windows, though the power was steady now. Back in Nashville, the memory clung, a quiet unease that followed me into crowded bars and busy streets. I'd hear whispers in the hum of traffic, see shadows stretch unnaturally long in my apartment hallway. Sleep brought dreams of that tank, water closing over my head, limbs twisting in the dark. I researched the lodge once late at night, finding forum posts about eerie sounds, guests vanishing without checkout. One claimed to hear arguments from empty rooms, echoes of past miseries replaying like scratched records. The place shut down a year later, condemned for safety violations, but satellite images show it still standing, vines claiming the walls, forest pressing closer. In the Appalachians, structures like that absorb the sorrow of those who pass through, turning isolation into something malevolent, a pull that draws you back in dreams. I avoid the mountains now, stick to flatlands where the horizon is open, but on still nights, when phosphors drip and elevators groan in my building, I wonder if the hills conspire to keep their secrets buried deep, whispering invitations to return, to join the quiet chorus below the surface. And sometimes, in the mirror's fog, I see her eyes, wide and pleading, asking why I left her there alone.
Story 4.
It was the spring of 1919 when I first set foot in the foothills of North Carolina, drawn by the promise of steady work in the lumber mills that dotted the landscape like scars on the earth's hide. The war had ended the year before, but its echoes lingered in the men who returned, hollow-eyed and quick to anger, and in the towns that struggled to rebuild. I'd come from up near Asheville, where the farms were failing and the soil too rocky for much besides stubborn weeds. Millwork seemed to step up. Hard labor, sure, but it paid in cash, and the air in those valleys carried the clean bite of pine sap instead of coal dust. The town was called Milford, a cluster of clapboard houses and a few stores huddled along a muddy main street backed by endless ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains. My cabin sat on the edge, a modest affair of rough-hewn logs with a tin roof that amplified every raindrop into a drumbeat. It wasn't much, a single room with a pot-belly stove, a cot, and a table scarred from years of use, but it was mine, rented cheap from the mill boss. Nights there were filled with the patter of water on metal when storms rolled in, which they did often that season, and the distant howl of wind threatened through the pines like a lonesome spirit calling for company. I shared the mill shifts with a rough crowd, loggers deeper in the hills, their hands calloused and their stories laced with moonshine-fueled bravado. We'd clock out at dusk, muscles aching, and trudge home under skies that threatened more rain, the forest pressing close as if eager to reclaim the cleared land. Life settled into a rhythm quick enough, the days blurring with the whine of saw blades and the thud of felled trees. Mornings started with weak coffee brewed over the stove, the steam mingling with the damp chill that seeped through the cracks in the walls. I'd walk the half-mile to the mill, boots sinking in the red clay paths turned to slurry by overnight showers. The other workers nodded greetings, but talk was sparse. Folks in these parts kept to themselves, wary of outsiders, even if you hailed from just a county over. Evenings I'd sit on the porch if the weather held, whittling sticks or reading dog-eared poke magazines by lantern light, the forest the dark wall beyond the rail. Sounds carried strange in the hollows, owls hooting low, branches snapping under unseen weight, the occasional yip of a fox that could fool you into thinking it was a child's cry. I'd heard tales from the old-timers about pharaoh folk living wild in the deep woods, descendants of deserters from the Civil War who'd gone native, shunning towns and surviving on what the land provided or took. They watch, you know. One, a grizzled logger named Harlan, muttered over lunch one day, his eyes scanning the tree line. Ain't seen, but felt. Best not wander alone after dark. I laughed it off then, figuring it for superstition born from too many isolated winters, but those stories stuck, worming into the quiet moments when the rain started up again. The first incident came in late May, during a downpour that turned the roads to rivers and kept most folks indoors. The Grovers, a family of 5 running a small general store in town, were found the next morning by a neighbor checking on them. The door had been bashed in, splintered like kindling, and inside, well, the details spread like wildfire through the mill. Mr. Grover and his wife lay in their bed, heads cleaved by what looked like axe blows, deep and precise. The children had scattered, but 2 were caught in the hall, wounded bad but alive, whimpering about a shadow in the storm. No valuables taken, not even the cash box under the counter. The sheriff from the county seat came down, a stern man with a mustache like barbed wire, and called it a burglary gone wrong, maybe a drifter soaked and desperate. But folks whispered otherwise. Why leave the money? Why use an axe from the woodpile out back, left embedded in the floor like a marker? The town buried the dead quick, the rain turning the graveyard to mud, and we went back to work. But a hush fell over conversations. Eyes darted to strangers passing through, loggers from other camps or peddlers with wagons creaking under load. I checked my own door that night, wedging a chair under the knob for good measure, the tin roof drumming a relentless tattoo as thunder grumbled in the distance. June brought more storms, heavy and unrelenting, the kind that swelled the creeks and isolated the town further, washing out bridges and turning hikes into slogs. The second attack hit the Millers, a couple homesteading a few miles up the ridge. Again, on a rainy evening, the door forced axe wounds that killed the husband outright and left the wife clinging to life long enough to murmur about jazz music playing faint from their phonograph, a luxury they'd splurged on from a catalog. She died before dawn, and the pattern emerged, always in the rain, when the noise could mask an approach, and target in homes where windows were cracked open against the humidity, music drifted out like an invitation. The sheriff posted notices, urging folks to lock up tight, but fear took root, quiet and insidious. At the mill, shifts dragged with muttered speculations. Who could it be? A vagrant or someone local nursing a grudge from the war years? Harlan spun yarns about forest legends, killers blending into the mist like pharaoh men. But I kept my head down, focusing on the work. My cabin felt more exposed now, the forest closer, its shadows lengthening as days shortened. I'd lie awake, listening to the patter. Every creak of settling wood jolted me upright. By July, the attacks had claimed 2 more families, always the same. Doors breached, axe from the premises, no theft, just violence, swift and unexplained. The town lived in hushed terror, stores closing early, lanterns burning late into the night. Conversations dropped to whispers in the mill yard, eyes darting to every stranger, suspicions turning neighbors distant. Then came the letter, slipped under the door of the local paper one foggy morning. It was published the next day, the words chilling in their calm. "I'll be passing through on the 19th. Play jazz loud and I'll spare your home. Silence the music and feel the axe." It felt like a cruel joke, but no one laughed. Jazz wasn't common in these hills. Fiddles and banjos, sure, but records of ragtime and blues were rare, trickling in from cities like Charlotte. Folks scrambled, borrowing phonographs, cranking up tunes on stormy nights in hopes of warding off whatever lurked. I didn't own one, but Harlan lent me an old Victor with a scratched record of some New Orleans band, the notes tinny and foreign against the rain's roar. That night, the 19th, the storm hit fierce, wind lashing the pines and thunder rolling like artillery over the ridges. The air was thick with humidity and tension, the kind that makes your skin prickle and your breath come short. I'd barricaded my door with the table wedged tight and set the phonograph playing low. Too loud felt like tempting fate, but silence worse. The music scratched out, horns wailing against the downpour as I sat by the lantern, shotgun across my lap, borrowed from the mill boss. Hours dragged, the roof pounding, water sluicing off the eaves and sheets. Lightning flashed intermittent, illuminating the woods in stark white, trees bending like supplicants. Then around midnight I heard it, the scrape of metal on wood, deliberate and patient, not the wind's random tug, but something purposeful, probing. My heart thudded, drowned in the jazz, as I crept to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. There in the downpour, a silhouette stood at the edge of the porch, axe in hand, rain sluicing off a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't rush, he savored the approach, stepping slow, testing the door with the blade's edge, the scrape echoing like nails on slate. Light then flashed again, bright and merciless, outlined in his form, tall, cloaked in oilskin, face obscured, but eyes catching the glare, flat and unfeeling. He paused, head tilted as if listening to the music, then vanished into the shadows when the thunder crashed. I didn't sleep that night, shotgun gripped white-knuckled, the record skipping to silence by dawn. No attack came, but others weren't spared. A widow down the road found hacked in her kitchen, door splintered, her phonograph untouched and quiet. The sheriff hunted leads, questioning drifters and feuding families, but trails went cold in the mud. I never saw his face clear, but the quiet menace of his presence haunted my sleep, turning dreams to chases through endless rain-slicked woods. Months passed, the storms eased into autumn's chill, attacks tapering, as if the killer had moved on or burrowed deeper into the hills. Milford rebuilt doors, buried its dead, but the fear lingered, a subtle dread in every gust of wind. I left come winter, headed north for factory work, but the foothills pull remains, a whisper in stormy nights. In Appalachia, storms bring more than water. They unearth dread from the soil, where old grudges and unseen threats blend into the mist, leaving you forever watchful of the dark, wondering if that scrape at the door is just a branch or something patient, waiting for the music to stop.
Story 5.
In the backwoods of Georgia, where the oaks drip with Spanish moss like shrouds over forgotten graves, and the air hangs heavy with the secrets of the soil, I arrived in the summer of 1832, seeking work that might steady my wandering life. I'd been drifting since my folks passed in a fever outbreak up near the Carolina line, leaving me with nothing but a satchel of tools and a willingness to labor for my keep. The Appalachian lowlands stretched out vast and unforgiving, ridges softening into swamps where the Chattahoochee River wound lazy and brown. Folks in these parts lived isolated, cabins scattered like afterthoughts amid the pines and hardwoods, connected only by rutted paths that turned to mire in the rains. Word reached me in a roadside tavern about a position at Hidden Manor, an old plantation house tucked deep in the hollows, owned by a widow named Eliza Hawthorne. She was said to be of means, inherited from a husband who'd made his fortune in cotton before meeting an untimely end. Some whispered accident, others poison, but no one spoke it loud. I was 25, strong from years of chopping wood and mending fences, and the promise of steady play outweighed the rumors. The overseer who hired me, a gaunt man named Silas with eyes like chipped flint, warned me plain, "Do your work, keep to yourself, and don't pry into the mistress's affairs." I nodded, figuring it for the usual caution in a house run by a woman alone. The manor loomed at the end of a long, overgrown drive, its white columns stained with age and mildew, flanked by slave quarters that huddled in the shadows like wary animals. It wasn't grand like the coastal plantations. This was backcountry, where the forest pressed close, vines creeping up the walls as if nature aimed to reclaim it. Oaks arched overhead, their branches heavy with moss that swayed in the breeze, casting dappled patterns on the ground that shifted like whispers. The air carried the thick scent of damp earth and blooming magnolias, undercut by something sharper, smoke from the kitchens or perhaps the faint tang of lye from the laundry sheds. I was put to work as handyman, fixing leaks in the roof, repairing the stable doors that groaned in the wind, and tending the grounds where weeds farted eternal against the south. The staff was small. A cook named Bess, round and silent, who avoided eye contact, a few field hands who toiled from dawn to dusk, their songs low and mournful, and Silas, who oversaw it all with a whip he rarely cracked but always carried. Mistress Hawthorne ruled from the parlor, a tall woman in her 40s, with hair pinned severe and dresses of black silk that rustled like dry leaves. She spoke quiet. Her voice carried an authority that needed no volume, and her eyes, pale blue, unblinking, seemed to measure a man's worth in a glance. She rarely ventured out, preferring the house's dim interiors, where candles flickered against wallpaper peeling at the edges. Days blended into a routine that felt both comforting and confining. Mornings started with the crow of a rooster, the air cool and misty as I rose from my bunk in the outbuilding, the floorboards cold underfoot. I'd fetch water from the well, the bucket creaking on its rope, and set to tasks assigned by Silas, patching a fence where deer had broken through, or clearing brush that encroached from the woods. The forest encircled the property like a living barrier, dense with undergrowth where ferns unfurled and vines tangled, hiding whatever trails led deeper into the hills. Locals spoke of feral people out there, outcasts who'd fled society during the Indian removals or earlier troubles, living wild on roots and game, their humanity frayed by solitude. "They watch from the trees," Bess muttered once while kneading dough, her voice barely above the crackle of the hearth fire, eyes in the dark, waiting for weakness. I dismissed it as folklore, the kind spun to keep children from wandering, but on evenings when fog rolled in from the river, blanketing the grounds in white, I'd feel a prickle on my neck, as if unseen gazes followed my steps back to the manor. Nights were when the isolation truly settled, a house creaking like an old ship at sea, wind sighing through the eaves. I'd lie awake in my quarters, the thin blanket doing little against the chill, listening to the distant hoots of owls or the rustle of leaves that could be wind or footsteps. The manor itself seemed alive after dark, sounds echoing from within, floorboards groaning upstairs, doors latching soft, and sometimes Faint cries that I told myself were foxes in the woods or wind whistling through cracks. But they came from the attic, muffled and desperate, like someone pleading through a gag. The first time I heard them, I sat bolt upright, heart thudding, straining to make sense of it. Silas had forbidden the upper floors to us workers, Mistress's private domain, he'd said, his tone leaving no room for questions. Curiosity gnawed at me, slow and persistent, like rot in wood. What did she keep up there? Valuables, or something darker, tied to the whispers of her husband's death? The staff avoided talk of it, eyes dropping when I probed gentle, but I caught fragments, disappearances among the servants, folks who'd worked the fields one day and vanished the next, chalked up to runaways heading north. Bess crossed herself once when a young girl from the quarters went missing, muttering about the attic's hunger. As weeks turned to months, the dread built gradual, a creeping vine wrapping around my thoughts. The work grew heavier, storms lashed the manor, tearing shingles and flooding the cellars, leaving me hooked and weary. Mistress Hawthorne watched from the windows sometimes, her silhouette framed in the glass, expression unreadable. She called me in once to fix a loose banister, her parlor smelling of lavender and dust, shelves lined with leather-bound books on medicine and anatomy, yellowed pages marked with diagrams of human forms. "You're reliable," she said, her voice smooth as riverstone, unlike some. I nodded, tools in hand, but her gaze lingered, appraising, as if seeing beyond my sweat-streaked shirt to the questions brewing inside. That night the cries returned, louder, a low moan that twisted into sobs before cutting off abrupt. I paced my room, lantern flickering shadows on the walls, the air thick with humidity that made sleep impossible. Outside the forest whispered, branches scraping like fingers on glass, and I wondered about those feral legends. Were they truly wild, or driven mad by what they witnessed in places like this? Curiosity overtook caution one humid evening in late August, the sun dipping behind the ridges in a blaze of orange, casting long shadows across the lawn. The house was quiet. Silas had ridden to town for supplies. Bess retired early to her cabin, the field hands scattered to their quarters with the day's exhaustion. I'd finished mending a shutter, tools stowed, but instead of heading back, I slipped inside through the kitchen door, heart pounding steady. The manor felt emptier than usual, halls dim with the fading light, the grandfather clock ticking like a heartbeat in the foyer. I crept upstairs, steps careful on the worn treads that sighed underfoot, avoiding the ones I knew creaked loudest. The air grew warmer as I ascended, carrying a faint acrid scent, medicinal like carbolic acid mixed with something metallic. The attic door was at the end of the upper hall, locked as expected, but I'd pocketed a skeleton key from the tool shed weeks back, figuring it for emergencies. It turned with a soft click, the sound echoing in the silence, and I pushed open the door, a rush of stale air greeting me like a sigh. Inside, the sight chilled me to the bone, the attic a cavern of horrors lit by slivers of moonlight through boarded windows. Dust motes danced in the beams, but my eyes fixed on the figures chained to the walls, servants or what remained of them, their bodies marked with experiments in pain. There were three, 2 men and a woman, emaciated, skin etched with precise incisions, some fresh and weeping, others scarred over like deliberate patterns. Their eyes were hollow with resignation, meeting mine not with pleas, but a dull acceptance, as if hope had long fled. Manacles bit into wrists and ankles, chains rattling faint with their shallow breaths. Tables nearby held instruments, scalpels, vials of murky liquids, notebooks filled with neat script detailing observations on endurance and reaction. It wasn't overt cruelty, no wild lashing or shouts. It was methodical, almost scientific, prolonging suffering in the name of some twisted curiosity. The young girl who'd vanished weeks back lay on a cot, her arm bandaged where flesh had been excised, her whimpers the source of those nightly cries. I froze, bile rising, the room spinning as the weight of it crashed down. The disappearances weren't runaways. They were fodder for this hidden laboratory, privilege masking monstrosity in the quiet isolation of the manor. A floorboard creaked behind me, and I whirled to find Mistress Hawthorne in the doorway, her smile calm, almost serene, as if I'd arrived for tea. "Furious, are you?" she said, voice level, no anger, just that appraising gaze. "Knowledge requires sacrifice." She stepped closer, a syringe glinting in her hand, and in that moment I saw the depth of it. Years of unchecked power in these backwoods where help was miles away and screams swallowed by the forest. I bolted past her, shoulder clipping the frame, down the stairs in a blur, heart hammering as her footsteps followed unhurried. Out into the night I ran, through the grounds where moss hung like nooses, the woods enveloping me like a shroud. Branches whipped my face, roots snagged my boots, but I didn't stop until the manor faded behind, the river's murmur guiding me to a hidden crossing. I fled the region that night, hitching rides on wagons bound north, putting hollows and ridges between me and hidden manor. Word spread in whispers among the workers I'd known, carried on the wind like seeds, disappearances mounting, nights when the house seemed alive with muffled screams, but no one dared confront her, fear rooting them deeper than any chain. Silas vanished soon after, they said, and Bess too, leaving the fields fallow. I settled in a mill town up in Tennessee, taking odd jobs, but the dread followed, a subtle unease in crowded places, reminding me how privilege can hide atrocity behind closed doors. In the Appalachian lowlands, history buries its horrors deep, but they seep through like groundwater, poisoning the present with quiet reminders that evil wears a familiar face, smiling calm as it invites you in. Even now, on still nights when the wind sighs through the eaves, I hear those cries, faint and desperate, wondering if she's still there, experimenting in the shadows, or if the forest has finally claimed her secrets, leaving only echoes for the feral ones to ponder in the dark.
Story 6.
I found myself traversing the rugged passes of Pennsylvania in the autumn of 1887, a time when the railroads hadn't yet tamed the wilder stretches of the Alleghenies, and travel meant days on horseback along trails that snaked through dense forest and sheer drops. I'd left Philadelphia behind, bound for Pittsburgh with a satchel of survey maps and a commission from a mining company to scout coal seams in the western hills. The work suited me, 28 years old, unmarried, with a taste for solitude that city life had soured. But the mountains had a way of amplifying that isolation, turning it from comfort to something heavier, like the mist that clung to the ridges most mornings, obscuring the path ahead. The air carried the sharp tang of fallen leaves and damp earth, and the wind whispered through the pines, carrying echoes that could fool a man into thinking he wasn't alone. I'd heard tales from tavern keepers along the way about these parts, old legends of pharaoh folk hiding in the hollows, descendants of settlers who'd gone mad from the endless winters, surviving on what they could hunt or steal. "Keep to the main trails," one grizzled innkeeper advised, his eyes darting to the darkening woods outside. "Stray off, and the hills might claim you." I nodded polite, chalking it up to superstition, but as days wore on, the forest's hush grew unnerving, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant cry of a hawk. The storm caught me unprepared, rolling in from the northwest with thunder that echoed off the cliffs like cannon fire. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the trail to mud that sucked at my horse's hooves, and the wind howled fierce, bending the trees like supplicants. Dusk was falling early under the heavy clouds, and I knew better than to push on. Night in these passes meant blindness, with drops that could send a man plummeting hundreds of feet. That's when I spotted the inn, perched on a cliffside ledge like it had been carved from the rock itself. The sign creaked in the gale, "Cliffside Rest," the letters faded but legible in the fading light. It was a sturdy building, 2 stories of weathered stone and timber, with smoke curling from the chimney, and a stable out back where lamplight flickered inviting. I tied my horse under the overhang, water streaming from my oilskin coat, and pushed through the door into a warmth that smelled of wood smoke and stew. The common room was dim, lit by a few lanterns and a fire crackling in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the plank walls adorned with faded maps and a stuffed owl that stared glassy-eyed from its perch. The owner emerged from behind the counter, a scholarly man in his 40s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a disarming smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Elias Thorne, his voice cultured, almost out of place in this remote spot. Remnants of an education back east, he said, before the call of the mountains drew him here. "Rough night for travel," he remarked, wiping his hands on a clean apron, his manner warm as he poured a mug of hot cider. "You're wise to stop. Rooms are scarce in these passes." I thanked him, paying for a bed and supper, noting the emptiness of the place, only a couple of tables occupied by weary-looking travelers, a peddler with his bundles randally, and a miner nursing a drink, his face smudged with coal dust. Thorne chatted easy as he served the meal, venison stew thick with root vegetables, speaking of the area's history, old Indian trails, forgotten mine shafts that honeycombed the cliffs, and whispers of lost souls who wandered the woods. His smile never faltered, but there was a precision to his words, like a man measuring each one. He assigned me a room upstairs with a window overlooking the endless forest that dropped away into the valley below, the view both breathtaking and vertiginous in the storm's flashes. That first evening passed quiet enough, the rain drumming steady on the roof, lulling me into a fitful rest after the day's ride. But as night deepened, the isolation pressed in, the inn's walls seeming to shift subtle in the candlelight, creaks echoing like breaths from hidden corners. I'd blown out the flame, lying in the dark with the quilt pulled tight, when strange noises emanated from below, scraping like furniture moved in secret, muffled thuds that could be logs on the fire, but felt deliberate, rhythmic. I sat up, ears straining, but the sounds faded into the wind's moan, leaving me doubting my senses. Morning brought weak sunlight filtering through the clouds, the forest steaming as the mist lifted. I descended for breakfast, expecting to see the other guests, but the common room held only Thorne, glassing coffee pots behind the counter. "The peddler and miner?" I asked, spooning oatmeal. He shrugged, smile easy, left at first light, urgent business westward. Their belongings, I noticed later in the stable, were neatly packed away in a corner, saddles oiled and ready, as if awaiting owners who might never return. It niggled at me, but travelers came and went abrupt in these hills. I pushed it aside, saddling my horse and riding out into the crisp air. Fate, or perhaps the mountain's caprice, brought me back 2 days later. My surveys led me looping through the passes, and another storm brewed, fiercer than the last, forcing me to seek shelter at the inn once more. Thorne welcomed me like an old friend, his disarming smile flashing as he stabled my horse himself. "Back so soon? The hills have a way of drawing folks in." The common room was busier this time, a family of 4 heading to Ohio, the parents weary from the trail, children fidgety, a lone salesman with a case of elixirs, and an elderly couple whispering by the fire. Supper was hearty, Thorne regaling us with tales of the forest legends, eerie sounds in the night that mimicked lost voices, unexplainable dread that settled on campsites, making men abandon gear and flee. The family laughed nervous, the salesman boasted of his travels, but I caught Thorne's eyes lingering on each guest, appraising like a scholar noting specimens. As we retired, the storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the cliffs in stark relief, thunder shaking the panes. Sleep evaded me that night, the scraping noises returning louder, interspersed with faint clinks like metal on stone. The walls amplified them, or perhaps my imagination did, but they seemed to come from the basement, below the common room. I lay still, pulse quickening, telling myself it was Thorn tending the stores, moving barrels against the floodwaters that sometimes seeped in. But curiosity, that damnable itch, grew with each muffled thud. Around midnight, unable to bear it, I slipped from bed, boots soft on the floor, and crept downstairs, lantern hooded low. The common room was empty, embers glowing in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced unnatural. A faint chemical scent hung in the air, acrid like lime or something sharper, biting at my nostrils. It led me to a door behind the counter, unmarked but ajar just a crack, as if inviting exploration. I pushed it open, steps descending into cool darkness, the scent strengthening with each tread. The basement was a labyrinth, low-ceilinged with stone walls slick from moisture, corridors branching off like veins in the cliffside. Shelves lined the paths, stocked with jars of preserves and tools, but false doors dotted the walls, panels that swung open to reveal hidden chambers, traps disguised as storage. My lantern flickered, throwing erratic light, and I followed the scraping deeper, heart racing now, the isolation of the inn above feeling worlds away. In one chamber, I found the truth amid the gloom, vats bubbling soft with a corrosive liquid, the chemical fumes thick enough to water my eyes. Floating remnants, cloth scraps, bone fragments, hinted at horrors dissolved away. Nearby, a kiln smoldered, ash fine and white, and shoots from above suggested how bodies might arrive unseen. The family from supper, their belongings were here, neatly folded in a corner, alongside the peddler's wares and the miner's tools for my first day. Thorn didn't kill for thrill. It was calculated, a business of luring travelers with his scholarly charm, dispatching them quiet, perhaps drugged meals or gas piped into rooms, then stripping assets for profit, bodies disposed in acid vats to leave no trace. Insurance papers I glimpsed on a desk, forged claims on lives snuffed out. Scrape echoed close, and I whirled to see him in the doorway, spectacles glinting, smile still disarming, but eyes cold as the mountain streams. "Curious souls seldom leave," he said, voice even, a syringe in hand, perhaps chloroform or worse. Panic surged, and I bolted past him, shoulders slamming into stone as I navigated the maze, his footsteps behind silent, methodical, like a predator conserving energy. False doors confused me, leading to dead ends where traps snapped shut, but I found a narrow window high in one wall, barred but loose from age. I pried it free, glass shattering quiet in the storm's roar, and hauled myself out into the cold air, tumbling down the cliffside slope amid brambles and rocks. The forest swallowed me, rain masked in my trail, but his pursuit lingered in my mind, methodical, unhurried, as if he knew the hills would aid him. I stumbled through the night, thorns tearing at my clothes, eerie sounds pursuing, branches snapping deliberate. Or was it him? Dawn found me at a miner's camp, miles down the path, gasping the tale to disbelieving ears. The sheriff rode out, but Thorn was gone, the inn abandoned, basement cleared save for faint chemical stains and empty vats. No bodies, no proof, just vanished guests and whispers of more along the trails. I left those mountains soon after, settling in the flatlands where horizons stretch open, but the experience left me distrustful of solitary stops, every inn a potential snare, with smiling hosts hiding depths. In Appalachia's winding roads, hospitality can mask predation, where the quiet charm of a scholar conceals a labyrinth of deception, turning weary journeys into final rests amid the unyielding hills. Even now, on stormy nights, when winds creak the eaves, I hear that scraping below, faint and patient, wondering if he's still out there, perched on some forgotten cliff, waiting for the next traveler to seek shelter in the dark.
Story 7.
During the sweltering summer of 1985, in the valleys of southeastern Ohio, where the Appalachian foothills roll gentle but unforgiving, a shadow fell over our quiet neighborhood like a veil drawn slow across the sun. I'd grown up in those parts, in a small town called Millfield, nestled in a hollow between ridges thick with maples and oaks that whispered secrets when the wind stirred. The place was the kind where folks knew each other's business without much asking. Port swings creaking in the evenings, kids chasing fireflies until dusk, and the distant hum of coal trucks rumbling down the highway. But that year, the heat hung heavy, turning the air to soup and the nights to something oppressive, where sleep came fitful and dreams twisted into unease. I'd just turned 19, fresh out of high school with no clear path ahead, so I took a night job at the diner on the edge of town, slinging plates of meatloaf and gravy to truckers and locals who worked the late shifts at the mines. It paid enough for gas in my old Chevy, and a bit left over for dreaming about leaving, maybe heading to Columbus for something bigger. Walking home after closing became my routine. 2 miles along darkened streets lined with those whispering maples, their leaves rustling like hushed conversations just out of earshot. The sidewalks were cracked from years of frost heave, and streetlights buzzed faint, casting pools of yellow that left plenty of shadows in between. I didn't mind the solitude at first. It gave me time to think, to shake off the grease smell clinging to my uniform. Millfield wasn't much: a post office, a hardware store, a couple of churches with steeples piercing the skyline like accusatory fingers. Homes were modest, clapboard affairs with yards backing onto woods that stretched endless into the hills. Folks here traced roots back generations, some to settlers who'd carved homesteads from the wilderness, others to immigrants drawn by the coal booms. But they were always stories, the kind passed down over kitchen tables or around campfires. Forest legends of feral people lurking in the deep hollows, outcasts who'd shunned society after the wars or hard times, living wild on berries and game, their eyes gone strange from too much isolation. "They watch, you know," my pa used to say, nursing a beer on the porch, his voice low as the crickets chirped. "Ain't violent mostly, just curious, like ghosts checking on the living." I'd laugh it off as a kid, but in those humid nights of 85, with sweat trickling down my back as I walked, those tales took on a weight, making every rustle in the underbrush feel like eyes on me. The neighborhood was a grid of quiet streets, houses spaced far enough for privacy, but close enough for neighborly nods. Mrs. Harlan next door baked pies that smelled like heaven. The Thompsons down the block kept bees, their hums humming soft in the daylight. But after dark, the world shrank, the forest encroaching like it aimed to swallow us whole. It started subtle, the way dread always does in these valleys, not with screams or blood, but with glimpses that nagged at the edges of your mind. My shifts ended around midnight, the diner locking up after the last coffee refill, and I'd set out under a sky pricked with stars, the heat still radiating from the asphalt. The first time it was just a feeling, a prickle on the nape of my neck, like breath too close. I glanced back, seeing nothing but the empty road curving into shadow, maples swaying gentle in the breeze. "Wind," I muttered to myself, quickening my pace a touch. But the next night, there it was, a figure in the periphery, standing at the mouth of an alleyway between 2 houses, motionless as a statue. Tall, shrouded in the dark, no features clear, just a shape that blended with the night. I stopped, heart skipping, but when I turned full, it was gone, leaving only the echo of footsteps fading soft on the gravel. I told myself it was a neighbor out for a smoke, or maybe old Mr. Ellis walking his dog. But the dog always barked, and Mr. Ellis shuffled loud. Shaking it off, I hurried home, the key turning in the lock with a click that felt too final. Days blurred hot and hazy, the sun baking the earth until cracks spiderwebbed the lawns. At the diner, talk turned uneasy, folks whispering over their meals about break-ins up in Athens County, just over the ridge. Nothing stolen, just homes entered quiet, occupants startled awake by a presence at the bedside. One woman claimed she'd seen a man at her window, face pressed close. But when the police came, no prints, no sign. "Probably some drifter," the cook grumbled, flipping burgers with a spatula scarred from use. But I caught the glances, the way eyes darted to the windows as night fell. My walks home grew tense, the streets emptier, folks bolting doors earlier against the swelter. The figure appeared again a week later, this time closer, trailing me from a block back, steps echoing mine but never overtaking, a deliberate mimicry that chilled despite the heat. I'd speed up, and so would he. Slow down, and the rhythm matched. No calls, no threats, just that silent pursuit, vanishing when I reached my porch light. Pa noticed my jumpiness, asking over supper one evening, the fan whirring lazy overhead. "Some neat etching, son?" I shrugged, not wanting to sound foolish, but that night, lying in bed with the window cracked for any breeze, I heard it, a soft scratch at the screen, like nails testing the mesh. The attack started mid-July, swift yet deliberate, striking homes at random like lightning from a clear sky. The first was the Thompsons, woke to a man in their bedroom, knife glinting in the moonlight filtering through curtains. He didn't speak, just lunged quick, leaving Mr. Thompson with a gash across his arm that needed stitches, Mrs. Thompson hysterical but unharmed. They said he slipped out the unlocked window like smoke, no face seen, just a lean build in the scent of sweat and earth. The police patrolled more, their cruisers rolling slow with lights off, but Millfield's streets wound tricky, alleys feeding into woods where a man could disappear easy. Folks locked windows despite the heat, fans humming futile against the stifling air. I switched to driving some nights, but gas was tight, and the walks continued, each one laced with unexplainable dread. The figure became a constant, glimpses in the shadows of maples, a silhouette at the edge of streetlight pools, watching with a patience that unnerved more than any chase. Whispers spread of a stalker prowling the silent nights, preying on the isolated. Perhaps one of those feral legends come down from the hills, driven by hunger or madness. At the diner, customers swapped stories. Strange sightings of a man in the tree line, eerie sounds like footsteps circling houses after midnight. "Ain't no ghost," Pa said one evening, newspaper folded on his lap. "Just a sick soul, but the hills hide him well." August brought no relief, the heat wave peaking with days over 90, nights barely dipping below 80. My uniform stuck to me like a second skin as I clocked out, the diner's neon sign buzzing farewell. Driving felt safer, but that night the Chevy wouldn't start, battery dead from the heat, or so I thought. Cursing under my breath, I set out on foot, the streets deserted, maples whispering louder in a faint breeze. The feeling hit halfway home, that prickle intensifying to a certainty. Footsteps echoed behind, measured and close. But when I spun, the road lay empty, shadows pooling deep. I quickened, heart thudding, the rustle of leaves sounding like breath now, close enough to feel on my neck. At my door, fumbling with keys in the dim porch light, I felt his presence. Warm air displaced, a glint of metal catching the bulb's glow. He was there, inches away, knife in hand, face obscured by shadow, but eyes burning with calm intent. I bolted inside, slamming the door, barricading it with a chair as my hand shook. Scratches came patient at the frame, nails or blade testing the wood, and then his voice, calm, almost seductive in its menace. "I'll be back. You can't hide forever." It slithered through the cracks, wrapping around me like the heat itself. Paul called the police from the kitchen phone, his face pale as they arrived, flashlight sweeping the yard but finding nothing. No footprints in the dry grass, no signs of forced entry. Could be imagination, one officer suggested, but his partner shot him a look, knowing the pattern. They patrolled heavier after that, cruisers idling at corners, but he slipped through like smoke, striking again 2 nights later at Mrs. Harlan's, leaving her with a scar on her cheek and a fear that kept her windows boarded. The town hunkered down, conversations hushed, eyes vigilant even in daylight. I quit walking altogether, borrowing Pa's truck, but the ordeal etched a quiet vigilance into my days. Every rustle a harbinger, every shadow suspect. Sleep brought dreams of pursuits through endless valleys, his whispers echoing in the maples. The police never caught him, leads dried up like the creeks in that endless heat, and by fall the attacks tapered, as if he'd retreated to the hills or moved on. But folks wondered, sharing glances over fences, if he was still out there, watching from the tree line. I left Millfield the next spring, heading north for factory work, but the Appalachian outskirts cling to you, their solitude amplifying memories. In crowded cities, I still lock doors triple, startle at footsteps behind. On still nights, when winds whisper through urban trees, I hear his scratches, patient and promising, reminding that safety is an illusion in the dark. where a single predator can turn familiar paths into mazes dread. And sometimes, staring into shadows, I wonder if he's followed, lurking in the periphery, waiting for the heat to rise again.
Story 8.
In the rural stretches of Kentucky during the sticky summers of the 1970s, where the hills folded in on themselves like old quilts and the air hummed with cicadas day and night, I spent my weekends volunteering at the county fairs that popped up like wildflowers along the back roads. I was 23 back then, working days at a feed store in Harlan County, loading sacks of corn and chatting with farmers whose faces were etched deep with the lines of hard living. The fairs were a break from that grime, a chance to see folks smile, hear the tinny music from the carousel, and watch kids chase after cotton candy dreams. But there was always that undercurrent in Appalachia, a quiet isolation that made even crowded events feel lonesome, like the forest was watching from the edges, ready to swallow the laughter whole. The towns were small, connected by winding roads that twisted through dense woods, cabins tucked away in hollows where the sun barely reached midday. Folks here clung to traditions, but whispers of forest legends lingered. Feral people skulking in the deep brush, survivors of old feuds or mining disasters who turned wild, their eyes gleaming in the dark as they scavenged what the land offered or took. I'd heard those tales from my grandpop, sitting on his porch with a pipe, the smoke curling like mist off the ridges. "They ain't monsters," he'd say, voice gravelly from Black Lung. "Just folks broken by the hills. But broken folks do desperate things." The clown showed up at those fairs like clockwork, a local entertainer named Harlan Happy Reeves, his face painted white, with exaggerated red lips and a nose like a cherry tomato. He performed under a striped tent, twisting balloons into dogs and hats, pulling quarters from behind ears while kids giggled and clapped. To them, he was magic, a burst of color in our faded world. But to those who looked closer, like me, there was an ease in the way his painted smile never reached his eyes, those blue orbs flat and distant, like ponds frozen over in winter. I'd started volunteering to help set up booths, hauling crates of prizes and stringing lights that buzzed faint against the evening sky. It was at the Breathitt County Fair in '76 that I first noticed him lingering after his shows, chatting with the older boys, teens on the cusp of manhood, lanky and restless, drawn by promises of odd jobs or rides in his battered Ford pickup. "Got work out at the farm," he'd say, voice muffled under the makeup, clapping a gloved hand on their shoulders. "Easy money, fun times." The kids would nod, eyes lighting up, but some never showed up at school the next week, chalked up to running off to the cities or hitching west. Rumors circulated soft, like smoke from a dying fire. Missing youths last seen near his property, an isolated farmhouse deep in the woods off a gravel road that floodwaters turned impassable most springs. Folks dismissed it as small-town gossip, the kind born from boredom and too much moonshine. "Happy's harmless," they'd say at the diner, forking into pie. "Just a sad sack playing dress-up." But I wondered, lying awake in my rented room above the store, the fan whirring useless against the heat, why his laughter always sounded forced, echoing hollow in the tent. That summer dragged on relentless, the sun baking the fairgrounds into dust clouds that choked the air, mixing with the sweet grease from funnel cakes. I volunteered more, drawn by a restlessness I couldn't name, helping tear down at dusk when the crowds thinned and the lights flickered like dying stars. Reeves was always last to leave, packing his props slow, his clown suit sagging in the humidity. I'd catch him watching the stragglers, that painted grin fixed, but his posture shifting subtle, predatory almost, like a fox eyeing chickens. One evening, as thunder grumbled distant over the ridges, a boy named Tommy, a freckled kid of 15 I'd seen at the feed store with his paw, lingered by the tent, balloon sword in hand. Reeves leaned close, whispering something that made Tommy nod eager. "See you tomorrow," the clown said, voice carrying on the breeze as Tommy wandered off into the twilight. But Tommy didn't show for his shift at the hardware store next day, nor the one after. His folks reported him missing, posters tacked to telephone poles with his gap-toothed smile. But the sheriff shrugged it off. "Boys run off all the time round here. The hills call him away." I asked around quiet, at the bar where miners drowned their aches in beer, hearing fragments. Another kid gone last fair season, last spotted climbing into Reeves' truck. Whispers of eerie sounds from his farmhouse at night, like muffled cries carried on the wind. The forest around his place was thick, tangled with kudzu that hid old trails, and locals avoided it, muttering about unexplainable dread that settled when you ventured too close, like the air grew heavier, breaths coming short for no reason. Curiosity gnawed at me slow, like rot in an apple core, building through those sweltering weeks. I'd drive past the turnoff to his road sometimes, engine idling as I stared into the woods, branches arching on its skeletal fingers. The farmhouse set a mile in, I'd heard, a sagging two-story with peeling paint and a barn listing to one side, surrounded by fields gone fallow. No neighbors for acres, just the endless rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs that could be deer or something else. Feral stories surfaced more in my mind, Grandpop's voice echoing, folks turned savage by solitude, surviving in the shadows, their deeds blending with the legends. Was Reeves one of them, or just a lonely man with secrets buried deeper than mine shafts? I pushed it down, focusing on the fairs, but the disappearances mounted. 3 boys that summer, all linked loose to the clown's orbit. At the Jackson County event in August, under a sky heavy with unshed rain, I overheard 2 women by the quilt booth. Heard digging sounds out there at night, ground soft, they say, like it's been turned over. Their voices dropped when Reeves ambled by, honking a horn for laughs, but his eyes flicked their way, sharp for a split second, before the grin returned. It was an overcast afternoon in early September, the fair season winding down with leaves just starting to turn, when curiosity overtook caution like a creek breaching its banks. I'd finished my shift early, the air cool for once, carrying the scent of impending rain and pine. Instead of heading home, I drove out to his property, telling myself it was just to look, to quiet the questions buzzing in my head. The gravel road crunched under my tires, narrowing as the woods closed in, branches scraping the truck sides like warnings. The farmhouse emerged from the trees, isolated and still, no smoke from the chimney, his pickup parked crooked by the porch. I killed the engine a ways back, heart fetting steady, and approached on foot, the ground unnaturally soft underfoot, spongy, like walking on fresh-tilled earth, though no crops through here. The house loomed quiet, windows curtained, but a faint chemical tang hung in the air, like bleach mixed with something sweeter, rotting. Eerie sounds drifted from the barn, soft thumps like something heavy shifted, and I froze, imagining feral eyes peering from the tree line. But it was just wind, I told myself, rattling loose boards. Circling the house, avoiding the front door, I spotted the crawlspace access under the foundation, a low hatch half hidden by weeds. Why I note there, prying it open with trembling hands, I can't rightly say. Maybe the rumors, or that dread pulling like a current. The air inside hit me thick, decay's subtle rot seeping out like a sigh, mingled with the musty damp of earth. I crawled in on elbows and knees, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating joists draped in cobwebs and pipes draping condensation. The ground was uneven, mounded in places, and as I inched deeper, my hands sank into softness that yielded too easy. Panic rose slow, a cold wave, as I dug with bare hands, dirt caking under nails. Plastic sheeting emerged first, crinkled and stained, wrapped tight around shapes that were unmistakably human, limbs contorted, faces pale and preserved in expressions of frozen terror. Remains, 6 at least, boys with features I recognized from posters, Tommy's freckles, another's curly hair matted with soil. The air grew heavier, breaths shallow against the stench, and I wreathed quiet, mind reeling at the private horrors buried beneath that jovial facade. He didn't boast. His crimes were methodical, luring them with promises of fun, jobs, candy, a peek at forbidden magazines, then ending them here, in the dark, under his home, graves dug shallow for easy access or reminder. A shadow blocked the light at the hatch, and I scrambled back, flashlight swinging to illuminate Reeves standing there, clown makeup smudged from the day before, his smile calm as a still pond. No rage, no chase, just a quiet confession as he crouched low, voice unburdening like recounting a mild secret. They came willing, he said, eyes meeting mine without blink, wanted adventure. I gave them rest instead. He detailed it flat, the chloroform rags, the quick snaps of necks, the burials at night when the forest muffled the shovels. 33, he claimed, scattered under the house and in the woods, where pharaoh legends might cover any unearthed bones. I bolted past him, shoulder clipping the frame, running blind into the trees, branches whipping my face as his footsteps followed unhurried, crunching leaves like he knew the hills would tire me first. Rain started then, soft at first, turning the path to mud, and I lost him in the downpour, stumbling onto the main road where a passing logger picked me up, his truck rumbling away as lightning flashed. The sheriff raided the place that night, uncovering the crawlspace horrors. 26 bodies under the house, more in the barn and woods. All young men and boys vanished over years. Reeves surrendered quiet, no fight. His trial a somber affair that shattered the community, turning fairs into ghosts of themselves, booths empty and laughter forced. Folks avoided his name, celebrations somber with eyes darting to shadows. I left Kentucky soon after, heading north for factory work, but the weight clings still, a quiet horror in crowded places where grins seem too wide. In Appalachia's hidden corners, normalcy can conceal abomination, where a painted smile masks the graves below, fostering dread that simmers beneath the surface. Even now, at county events far away, when balloons pop sharp or wind whispers through maples, I hear those muffled cries from the dark, wondering if more like him lurk in the hollows, luring with fun, while the earth softens underfoot, waiting to claim its due.
Story 9.
We set sail from England in the spring of 1587, a ragtag group of souls chasing whispers of a new world across the vast Atlantic, where the land promised abundance beyond the famines and plagues that gnawed at our homeland. I was 26 then, a carpenter by trade, with calloused hands from years of hewing timber in the damp forests of Devon. My wife, Eleanor, heavy with our first child, clung to dreams of a fresh start, her eyes bright despite the seasickness that plagued her. Governor White led us, his maps charting a course to Virginia's shores, but storms battered our ships, scattering us like leaves in the wind. When we finally made landfall, it wasn't the gentle coast we'd envisioned. We drifted north into the shadowed folds of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where rivers carved deep valleys and the trees towered like ancient sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of pine and rich earth, a far cry from the salty brine we'd endured for months. We numbered over 100, men, women, children, unloading crates of tools, seeds, and livestock onto the rocky banks of a winding river. "This'll do," White declared, his voice steady against the murmur of doubt. We built our settlement in a clearing ringed by dense woods, felling oaks for cabins that smelled of fresh sap, their walls chinked with mud to ward off the chill. Smoke curled from hearths as we planted corn and beans, the soil yielding easy at first, as if welcoming us. Evenings brought fiddle tunes around the fire, stories of home mingling with hopes for this untamed paradise. But the mountains loomed close, their ridges blurring into blue haze, and in the quiet hours I felt the weight of their gaze, like the land itself was measuring our intrusion. Life in the colony settled into a rhythm, harsh but hopeful, as summer ripened the berries in the underbrush and fish leaped in the streams. I'd rise with the dawn, axe in hand, venturing into the woods with a few others to gather timber for expansions, a palisade to protect against whatever lurked beyond. The forest was a labyrinth, sunlight filtering through the canopy in speckled patterns that danced on the leaf-strewn floor, but it held a hush that unnerved me. No bird song in the deeper thickets, just the creak of branches and the occasional rustle that could be wind or wildlife. Eleanor busied herself with the garden, her belly swelling as our child grew, her laughter a balm against the isolation. We named the place New Haven, though it felt more like a foothold scratched into the wilderness. Supplies from the ships dwindled faster than expected, the promised resupply from England delayed by the same storms that had waylaid us. Governor White sailed back in August, vowing to return with aid, leaving us to fend through the coming winter. "Hold fast," he said, clasping my shoulder, his eyes betraying the worry he hid from the others. We rationed flour and salted meat, trading trinkets with the native tribes who appeared sporadically at the clearing's edge. Tall figures with painted skins, their language a melody of clicks and vowels we struggled to grasp. They warned of the woods and gestures and broken words, spirits they mined, or perhaps people gone wild, feral from years of solitude in the hollows. Legends, I thought, born from the same fears that birthed tales of will-o'-the-wisps back home. But as nights lengthened, their words lingered, seeding doubt in the quiet. Autumn brought a chill that seeped into the bones, the leaves turning to flames of red and gold before drifting down like warnings. The first strange sightings came then, subtle at first, easy to dismiss as tricks of the light. Jonathan, a young hunter, returned from a foray with tales of shadows flitting between trees, human-shaped, but moving too swift, too silent for any of us. "Eyes on me," he muttered over supper, his face pale in the firelight. Watching, but gone when I turned. We laughed it off, blaming hunger or the mists that rolled in from the river most mornings, blurring the boundaries between clearing and forest. But supplies stinned further, the cornstalks withering under early frosts, forcing more of us to venture deeper for game or roots. Eleanor fretted, her hands protective over her swell, urging me to stay close. "The woods whisper," she said one evening, as we lay in our cabin, the thatch roofs sighing under wind. I held her, listening to the eerie sounds outside, branches scraping like fingers on wood, distant snaps that echoed like footsteps retreating. Forest legends grew in our minds, stories shared in hushed tones around the fire. Feral people, descendants of lost explorers or runaways, surviving in the dense undergrowth, their humanity eroded by isolation, turning them furtive and desperate. "They take what they need," old Widow Hargrove whispered, her eyes darting to the tree line. Quiet like.
"No trace left." The disappearances started
in November, when the first snow dusted the ridges like powdered bone. Thomas, a sturdy farmer, set out at dawn to check snares along the riverbank, his musket slung over his shoulder. He didn't return by dusk.
We searched the next day, torches
cutting through the fog, calling his name until our throats rawed. No body, no blood.
Just his head,
snagged on a thorn bush and carved into a nearby tree bark. Grow a drawing.
The word chilled us, unfamiliar yet ominous, like a curse scratched in haste. The natives had spoken of a place or people
by that name,
but their meanings slipped through our grasp like smoke.
Governor White had mentioned it in passing, a distant island trinity, but here in the mountains, but felt like a mounter.
Warning from the land itself. We bolstered the palisade, posting watches through the nights, but the dread built slow, creeping vine wrapping our thoughts.
Eleanor gave birth in December, our daughter Anne's cries piercing the winter hush, a fragile light in the growing dark. But joy was short-lived. 2 more vanished that week, a mother and her boy, gone while gathering firewood. Their basket lay abandoned, contents scattered, and again that carving on a stump, Croatone. Whispers spread. Were the pharaohs responsible, luring our kin into the woods with mimicked calls? Or was it the natives, resenting our encroachment? No battles erupted, no arrows flew, just an emptying, one by one, as if the forest plucked us deliberate. Winter gripped the blue ridge like a fist, snow blanketing the ground and muffling sounds until the world felt entombed. Cabins huddled closer in our minds, hearths flickering against the cold that seeped through cracks. I took fewer risks, sticking to the clearing for repairs, but hunger gnawed relentless, our stores reduced to meager porridge and dried berries. Eleanor's milk thinned, Anne's cries weakening to whimpers that tore at me. The strange sightings multiplied, glimpses of figures at the tree line, ragged and hunched, vanishing into the mist before we could pursue. One night, as I stood watch, I heard it. Eerie sounds drifting from the woods, whispers that mimicked voices I knew. "Help," it called, faint like Thomas's timbre, then laughter echoing John's. I gripped my axe, heart pounding, but the palisade held no breach, the snow unmarked. Ghosts, some muttered, but I knew better. The land resisted us, its silence broken only by those unseen movements in the undergrowth, building unexplainable dread in the quiet hours. More disappeared. The blacksmith one moonless night, his forge still warm. A family of 4, their cabin empty come morning, door ajar and Croatoan etched on the hearthstone. We gathered in the common house, faces gaunt, debating flight, but the passes were snow-choked, rivers frozen treacherous. "We hold," I said, voice steadier than I felt, but Eleanor's eyes pleaded otherwise. Anne bundled close. By spring's thaw, our numbers halved, the settlement a ghost of itself, cabins sagging under meltwater. I volunteered for scouting trips, desperate to find game or aid from natives, kissing Eleanor farewell each dawn, her tears salt on my lips. The paths wound deeper into the woods, fog blurring boundaries, the air heavy with the rot of thawing earth. Alone, the isolation pressed, survival a threadbare cloak against the chill. I'd hear those whispers again, names called soft, footsteps padding parallel but unseen. Once, I glimpsed a figure through the haze, wild-haired, clothed in rags, eyes hollow with a feral gleam, slipping behind a trunk before I could call out. Legends made flesh, perhaps, or my mind fracturing under strain. Supplies gone, I pushed farther one April day, following a deer trail up a ridge, the river's murmur fading below. Hours stretched, the forest thickening until sunlight barely pierced, eerie sounds encircling, rustles that paused when I did, branches creaking like sighs. Dread built creeping, a subtle terror in the wilderness's vastness, where every shadow hit potential eyes. I found no game, just an abandoned native camp, ashes cold and Croatoan carved on a post, our word or theirs. Turning back as dusk fell, the fog thickened, disorienting, whispers now mimicking Eleanor's voice. "Come home." I stumbled into the clearing at nightfall, torch sputtering, but the settlement was gone. Huts dismantled, timbers scattered as if never stood, the ground churned but empty of footprints. No fires burned, no voices called, just the wind sighing through the trees, carrying faint echoes that could be cries or nothing. I searched frantic, calling names until hoarse, finding only Anne's blanket snagged on a bush, unstained but abandoned. Croatoan etched on the well's rim, the word mocking in the moonlight. Had they fled, carved by trembling hands, or taken, silent and swift, by those feral shadows? The mystery clawed at me, no signs of violence, just an emptying as if swallowed by the earth. I wandered the woods for days, surviving on roots and streams, dread my constant companion, until natives found me, their pitying eyes leading me to their village. They spoke of the land claiming intruders, but offered no answers, their legends blending with mine in the haze. Years blurred after, sailing back to England on a passing ship, but the Blue Ridge haunts me still, a subtle terror that seeps into dreams. I settled in a coastal town, remarried, but Eleanor's face fades not, nor Anne's cries. In Appalachia's ancient forests, isolation breeds enigmas, where communities fade without trace, leaving survivors to question if the woods themselves deem us intruders, whispering invitations in the wind. On still nights, when fog rolls in, I hear those voices again, faint and familiar, calling from the dense woods that never truly let go, wondering if they're out there still, waiting in the hush that speaks volumes.